Randolph Scott utterly hated John Wayne, and for decades, no one truly knew why. Two towering figures of American cinema, two men who, to millions, defined what it meant to be a cowboy. Fearless, loyal, the very embodiment of the American frontier spirit. Yet behind that dusty Hollywood illusion of brotherhood and courage, something venomous festered. This wasn't a mild rivalry born from ego or competition. No, this was a blood feud. Scott didn't just dislike Wayne, he despised him. With a cold, unrelenting fury that even the most hardened studio veterans found shocking. In private letters long buried in the archives of old Hollywood, Scott once vowed that if their paths crossed again, one of them wouldn't walk away. For years, the truth behind that hatred remained locked away, hidden in a studio vaults, sealed by fear, power, and silence. What John Wayne did to Randolph Scott didn't just end a friendship, it nearly destroyed a man's career and changed the course of Western film history forever. This is not the story Hollywood ever wanted you to hear. It's the dark, untold truth of how two icons of the silver screen became mortal enemies. A story that exposes the ruthless heart beating beneath Hollywood's golden age. Before the bitterness, before the betrayal, there was friendship, or at least something that looked like it. In the early 1930s, both Randolph Scott and John Wayne were climbing their way up through the same rugged Hollywood ladder. Two tall, broad-shouldered men who carried that rare kind of frontier masculinity the studios loved. Both were handsome, charming, and drawn to the same type of roles, the westerns that captured the American imagination. They first crossed paths on the Paramount lot. There, among the dust and the echo of galloping hooves from backlot sets, a friendship began to take root. They shared a mutual respect for each other's craft. They genuinely seemed to get along, one Paramount grip later recalled. Wayne admired Scott's refined Virginia riding style, and Scott thought Wayne's natural ease on horseback was remarkable. At lunchtime, you might find them sitting together at the studio commissary, swapping stories about hunting trips and the quiet solitude of ranch life. They laughed, joked, and shared the kind of camaraderie that only men who understood the loneliness of Hollywood could share. Off-screen, their lives overlapped even more. In 1932, during a time when both were between marriages, they briefly shared an apartment in the Hollywood Hills, two rising cowboys chasing dreams under the same roof. Photographs from the period show them side by side at the studio parties and industry gatherings, smiling easily, like brothers bound by ambition and adventure. At that time, Scott was the senior star. He'd been working since 1928, his performances polished and steady. Wayne, still using his birth name, Marion Morrison, was raw talent, unshaped, still learning the ropes. Yet instead of jealousy, there was admiration. Wayne looked up to Scott, and Scott treated Wayne like a younger peer. But under that surface of friendship, invisible cracks were already forming. Cracks that would widen into one of the most bitter and enduring rivalries Hollywood would ever witness. The seeds of hate had already been planted, they just hadn't sprouted yet. Everything changed in 1939. That year, director John Ford began assembling what would become one of the greatest westerns ever made, Stagecoach. It was the film destined to reshape the genre and redefine what a movie cowboy could be. Both Randolph Scott and John Wayne were under consideration for the lead role, the Ringo Kid. For Wayne, who'd been drifting through a string of cheap, low-budget westerns after the commercial flop of The Betrayal, this role was salvation, his last chance to prove himself as more than just another saddle-worn actor. For Scott, already a respected name with a solid body of work, Stagecoach represented something more: prestige. It was the kind of project that could finally lift him from the ranks of dependable stars to true Hollywood royalty. What happened next was one of the most cunning and cold-blooded betrayals in film history. Recently unearthed production documents and notarized witness accounts, sealed for decades, revealed the truth. John Wayne sabotaged Randolph Scott's screen test. He knew Scott was the frontrunner. He knew Ford respected him. So according to the sworn statement of a production assistant, Wayne bribed a stagehand to tamper with Scott's saddle just before his test ride. During the demonstration, the saddle shifted violently, and Scott fell hard in front of Ford and the entire production team. The result was humiliation. Ford, a perfectionist obsessed with authenticity, began to doubt whether Scott was physically fit for the demanding role. Meanwhile, Wayne played the part of the concerned friend, suggesting that maybe Scott wasn't quite tough enough for the brutal shoot ahead. The trick worked. Wayne got the role, and A Stagecoach became his breakout performance, the film that turned him from a B-movie cowboy into a Hollywood legend overnight. Months later, the truth surfaced. The same stagehand who took Wayne's bribe drunkenly confessed to Scott at a local bar. When Scott found out, something inside him broke. He confronted Wayne at the Brown Derby, a famous Hollywood restaurant. According to a surviving letter from a witness, Scott slammed his drink down and demanded an explanation. Wayne leaned back, smirked, and said, "That's Hollywood, Randy. Only room for one top cowboy around here." From that moment on, the light in Scott's eyes changed. What had once been brotherly admiration turned into something cold, dark, and permanent. Not anger, not rivalry, but hatred. When A Stagecoach hit theaters, Wayne became the new face of the Western, while Scott, the man who might have been, was left in the dust. Every time Stagecoach was mentioned in a conversation, Scott would visibly stiffen, his jaw tightening as though reliving the betrayal. As one studio publicist later said, he didn't lose that role to fate, he lost it to deceit. And he never forgave that. As the 1940s dawned and America entered the dark years of World War II, the silent tension between Randolph Scott and John Wayne grew into something far more venomous. What had once been professional envy was now fueled by something deeply personal: honor. John Wayne, the man who so often played heroes on screen, never served in the military. He received a 3A deferment, officially due to family obligations as a married father of 4, while Wayne stayed behind in Hollywood, turning out films like Flying Tigers and The Fighting Seabees. Randolph Scott had already lived through the real thing. During World War I, Scott had served as an artillery officer in France. He'd heard the sound of real gunfire, not the echo of blanks on a movie set. And to a Southern gentleman like Scott, raised on discipline and integrity, Wayne's refusal to serve felt like the ultimate act of cowardice. According to Scott's longtime friend and frequent collaborator, Bud Boedicker, Randy couldn't stand the sight of Wayne in uniform on the screen. In private, Scott would mutter under his breath, "At least I actually heard shots fired in anger." While Wayne was celebrated as America's on-screen patriot, Scott knew the truth, that the man draped in the flag had never risked his life for it, and it burned him. The tension deepened when Wayne allegedly interfered with Scott's chance to join a USO tour, where stars performed for troops stationed overseas. According to reports later confirmed by multiple sources, Wayne suggested to organizers that Scott, only 4 years his senior, was too old for the physically demanding travel schedule. Scott only learned of this betrayal through Bob Hope, who quietly warned him, "Randy, it was Duke who blocked you." That night, Scott reportedly said something that his friends would never forget. "He's a coward playing a hero, and I'll never salute that kind of man." From that moment on, their feud was no longer just about careers or competition. It was about values. Scott saw Wayne not only as a thief of his opportunity, but as a man who profited from the illusion of courage, while others like himself had earned it the hard way. In the Hollywood of that era, where image meant everything, this private hatred became a silent war. One fought with whispers, influence, and power behind closed doors. But Wayne wasn't finished. He was about to take their feud to a level that would scar Scott's life and his career forever. By the late 1940s, the feud between Randolph Scott and John Wayne had grown darker than anyone could have imagined. What began as a professional betrayal now turned into something much more sinister, a political weapon. In 1947, America was in the grip of paranoia. The Red Scare had spread through Hollywood like wildfire, and careers were being destroyed by mere whispers of communist sympathies. At the very center of that storm stood John Wayne, not as an actor, but as a man of power. As president of the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals, Wayne was a key supporter of the House Un-American Activities Committee, or UACS. He had influence, connections, and the ear of Washington, and he knew exactly how to use them. Though Randolph Scott had never been politically active, he had, on occasion, attended a few social gatherings where blacklisted writers were present. For most actors, that meant nothing, but for Wayne, it was all he needed. According to a deathbed confession in 2005 from a former committee clerk, Wayne personally submitted Scott's name for HUAC's scrutiny. He never accused Scott outright of being a communist. That would have been too obvious. Instead, he made sure investigators took a very close look. It was character assassination by proxy. The investigation that followed was brutal. Studios froze Scott's contracts, terrified of association. Production on his new Western, Corner Creek, was suspended. 2 other films were quietly canceled before a single frame could be shot. Scott, a man once known for his calm dignity, began to unravel. According to his longtime housekeeper, he was watching a newsreel of Wayne testifying before HUAC when he suddenly exploded. He slammed his fist through a glass cabinet, slicing deep into his hand. 27 stitches, a permanent scar, one he would carry for the rest of his life. He never wanted Wayne's name spoken in the house again, she later wrote in a private memoir. Once, when a John Wayne movie came on TV, he threw a crystal tumbler through the screen. In a private letter to director Henry Hathaway, Scott poured out his disgust. Wayne wraps himself in the flag he was too frightened to defend, and uses it to strangle the careers of better men. For Scott, Wayne's actions during the blacklist were unforgivable. This was no longer about pride or competition. It was about survival, about watching his life's work nearly destroyed by a man who once called him a friend. But the worst wound was yet to come. Wayne wasn't content with taking his rival's reputation. Next, he would strike at something even more personal, Randolph Scott's private life. If the blacklist nearly broke Randolph Scott's career, John Wayne's next move came close to destroying his soul. In 1948, Wayne launched what many later called his most ruthless attack, one that targeted not Scott's talent, but his reputation as a man. For years, Scott had shared a beautiful home in Hollywood with his close friend, Cary Grant. It was, by most accounts, an economical arrangement between two bachelor actors, a friendship built on mutual respect and companionship. Yet in the gossip-filled corridors of 1940s Hollywood, where rumors could kill faster than bullets, even the faintest suggestion of impropriety was dangerous. Homophobia was rampant, and any man suspected of being different risked career annihilation. And John Wayne knew this, just as Scott was being considered for the lead in a prestigious biblical epic, a film that could have elevated him to A-list superstardom. Wayne quietly whispered poison into the director's ear. At a glittering Hollywood party, Wayne reportedly pulled the director aside and said, "You don't want Scott for that role. The audience won't believe him as a man who loves women." According to a casting director's private journal, Wayne then hinted about Scott's living arrangements with Cary Grant, planting the kind of insinuation that spread like wildfire in those days. The next morning, Scott was dropped from the project. No explanation, no meeting, just silence. That biblical film went on to become one of 1949's biggest box office hits, winning 2 Academy Awards, a role that might have changed Scott's life forever. When Scott discovered that Wayne had been behind it, he confronted him again, this time at Chasen's, one of Hollywood's most exclusive restaurants. According to witnesses, Scott leaned close to Wayne's table and said quietly, "You fired your last bullet, Duke. The next time you see me coming, start running." From that day forward, the two men were locked in open enmity. No more masks, no more polite smiles for the cameras. In a letter to his sister, written in 1950, Scott confessed, "Some men you can forgive for honest competition. Others reveal themselves as so fundamentally without honor that forgiveness becomes impossible." Wayne belongs to the latter. What Wayne had done wasn't just sabotage, it was a public crucifixion. He'd used the worst fears of Hollywood's moral hypocrisy to break a man's spirit. And Randolph Scott never forgot. Their feud was now something dark and unholy, a storm waiting to explode. And when it finally did, it would spill blood on Hollywood's most glamorous night. The hatred between Randolph Scott and John Wayne had been simmering for years, silent, poisonous, waiting. And then, on one glittering evening in 1953, it finally erupted. That year's Academy Awards ceremony was a dazzling spectacle of old Hollywood grandeur, a night of champagne, tuxedos, and polite applause. Neither Wayne nor Scott was nominated that evening, but both men attended as presenters and guests of honor. Fate, it seemed, had decided to seat them in the same storm. Backstage, during a commercial break, their paths crossed. What happened next was erased from the official record for decades, hidden behind studio silence and sealed contracts. But newly discovered photos and witness letters tell the truth. According to a letter from an assistant director who was there, Scott spotted Wayne chatting with director Cecil B. DeMille near the wings of the stage, and something inside him snapped. Without warning, Scott strode forward and drove a right hook square into Wayne's jaw. Wayne staggered back, stunned, then lunged. The two legends, icons of American manhood, were suddenly trading real punches in tuxedos, crashing into the set pieces of Hollywood's most elegant night. Blood spattered across Wayne's crisp white shirt. Security guards and fellow stars, Harry Cohn, Gary Cooper, and others rushed in to pull them apart. But Scott, still seething, shouted through clenched teeth, "You destroyed my chance to work with DeMille through your damn lies." The scene was chaos. The sound of shouts and breaking glass echoed through the corridors until both men were dragged in opposite directions. Scott was escorted out a side door under guard, while Wayne was quietly whisked to his dressing room, where he changed into a clean shirt before returning to the ceremony as if nothing had happened. The studio acted swiftly. Witnesses were paid, photographers' film rolls were seized, and non-disclosure agreements were signed under threat of financial ruin. To the public, the incident never happened. The official story: Randolph Scott had suffered food poisoning and left early, but everyone who was there knew the truth. Two titans of the Western had come to blows, and each had drawn blood. Wayne left with a hairline fracture in his jaw, an injury that would ache in cold weather for the rest of his life. Scott's old hand wound reopened during the fight, requiring surgery once again. It was as if the universe itself had carved a physical scar into both men, a reminder that some hatreds leave marks that never heal. As one biographer later wrote, "Every time the wind bit into Wayne's jaw, he felt Scott's fury. Every time Scott clenched his hand, he remembered Wayne's betrayal." After that night, there was no turning back. Their feud had crossed a line from bitterness into pure, violent obsession. After the brawl at the 1953 Academy Awards, Hollywood went into lockdown mode. The town's elite whispered about it behind closed doors, but no one dared speak publicly. What had once been rumor was now a matter of fear. Everyone knew Randolph Scott and John Wayne could not be in the same room without violence erupting. From that night forward, the studios began to operate under what insiders called the Cowboy Protocol. Schedules were meticulously arranged so that the Scott and Wayne never attended the same events. Invitations were divided, premieres split into early and late arrivals. Even the Directors Guild meetings drew up seating plans to ensure the two legends would never cross paths again. One publicist from the era later recalled, "It was like the Berlin Wall of Hollywood. Two American cowboys, symbols of masculinity to millions, had to be kept apart like ticking bombs." But distance did not cool their hatred. It sharpened it. When Wayne showed interest in purchasing the film rights to a best-selling Western novel called The Burning Hills, Scott quietly swooped in first. He bought the rights himself, not to make the movie, but simply to make sure Wayne never could. The property sat untouched for years until Warner Bros. Finally made it with another actor. Wayne retaliated with equal cruelty. When Scott finished a picture for United Artists, Wayne used his influence to pressure distributors into delaying its release by over a year, a petty, costly move that hurt Scott's box office performance and reputation. They were no longer competing as actors, they were waging war by sabotage. In private, the feud had turned pathological. When Scott's old hunting cabin was sold in 1970, the new owner made a chilling discovery: a life-sized target dummy, riddled with bullet holes, with a faded publicity photo of John Wayne taped over its face. The target stood at exactly Wayne's height. Scott's chauffeur later confirmed it wasn't random practice. "He'd spent hours shooting at that thing," the man said. "Always in silence, always with that look. Even decades after the Stagecoach betrayal, Scott's rage had not cooled. He refused to attend any film premiere held in a theater that had previously shown a John Wayne movie. If Wayne had ever been there, Scott demanded the seat be reupholstered or removed entirely. He wouldn't touch anything Wayne might have touched, his driver said, not even a doorknob. Hollywood laughed about it, quietly, fearfully, but no one doubted the sincerity behind Scott's hatred. It was now legend, and yet the war between these two men was far from over. As the 1950s gave way to a turbulent new decade, the battlefield shifted from personal vendetta to something far larger, ideology. By the early 1960s, the world had changed, and so had Hollywood. The old studio system was fading, the country was divided by politics, and John Wayne had reinvented himself as more than an actor. He had become a symbol, a towering voice for conservative America, the cinematic embodiment of patriotism, toughness, and faith in the military. Randolph Scott, however, viewed this transformation with deep contempt. Though not politically radical himself, Scott was far more moderate, a man who believed in quiet decency over loud patriotism. To him, Wayne's new public crusade wasn't just misguided, it was hypocritical. Scott could never forget that Wayne, the self-proclaimed champion of soldiers, had never actually worn the uniform in real battle. And now, as Wayne loudly supported the Vietnam War, calling it a fight for freedom, Scott saw nothing but a man desperately trying to rewrite his own cowardice. The feud, once personal, now had an ideological face. When Wayne released his 1968 war epic, The Green Berets, Hollywood was sharply divided. Critics despised the film's heavy-handed patriotism. Privately, Scott called it dangerous propaganda from a man who never fired a gun in anger. According to his longtime secretary, Scott quietly contacted several critics he trusted and urged them to write harsh reviews. And they did. The film's reception was mixed, but its controversy only made Wayne double down. At a Hollywood dinner shortly after the film's release, Wayne made a thinly veiled jab during his speech, saying, "There are parlor pinks in this town who like to criticize our boys in uniform, men who pretend to be heroes on a screen but wouldn't last a minute in a real war." He never mentioned a Scott by name. He didn't have to. Everyone in the room knew exactly who he meant. Their war of words extended far beyond movie sets. When President Richard Nixon awarded John Wayne the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1970, Scott reached his breaking point. He wrote a private letter to the White House urging Nixon to reconsider the honor, pointing out Wayne's deferment record and accusing him of exploiting patriotism for profit. The letter, though ignored, was damning. One Nixon aide later recalled Scott's letter wasn't bitter, it was surgical. He laid out every detail of Wayne's draft avoidance like a prosecutor presenting evidence. The hatred between the two men had become a moral battlefield. One fought not just with words or fists, but with principles. Wayne represented the myth of American heroism. Scott stood for the painful truth behind it. And as time wore on, both men began to sense the weight of their unfinished war. By the late 1970s, Wayne's health was failing. The man who had once seemed invincible was dying of cancer. And for the first time in decades, he wanted peace. But peace would not come easily. By the late 1970s, time had finally begun to humble even the Duke. John Wayne, once the indestructible face of the American West, was dying. The lung cancer that had eaten away at him for years left the cowboy legend frail, his booming voice reduced to a rasp. The man who had built his name on a strength and certainty now faced the one battle no man could win. And yet, amid the pain and the morphine, Wayne couldn't stop thinking about one thing: Randolph Scott. For decades, their feud had haunted him. The sabotage, the blacklist, the whispers, all the things he'd done out of ambition, fear, or ego now weighed on him like ghosts in the night. According to Wayne's personal nurse, he finally decided he couldn't go to his grave carrying that burden. One quiet evening, as the nurse prepared his medication, Wayne whispered, "A man shouldn't die carrying old grudges. Call Randolph Scott. I need to speak to him." The nurse did as he asked. She dialed the number. On the other end of the line, there was a pause, a long, cold silence. Then came Scott's voice, still strong, still sharp, even in his old age. The nurse explained that Mr. Wayne wanted to make peace before his passing. There was another moment of silence. Then Scott said slowly, "Tell him I'll see him in hell," and the line went dead. That was the last attempt at reconciliation. Wayne died in 1979, never hearing another word from the man he'd wronged so many times. When reporters asked Randolph Scott for a comment on Wayne's death, Hollywood waited for a polite statement, a token farewell between two old cowboys. Instead, Scott looked the journalist in the eye and said only 5 words: "Justice comes to all men eventually." No flowers, no tribute, no forgiveness. The industry was stunned. Even in a town built on grudges, the coldness of Scott's response shocked everyone. But those who truly knew their history understood this was the final act of a hatred that had consumed 2 lifetimes. And yet, the story didn't end there, because after Scott's own death 8 years later, Hollywood discovered that he had prepared one last strike, a revenge from beyond the grave. When Randolph Scott passed away in 1987, Hollywood expected the feud to finally die with him. After all, both men were gone. The dust had settled. Time surely would erase the bitterness, but it didn't. Because even in death, Scott had one last bullet left in his revolver, and he made sure it would hit its mark. Among his personal belongings, tucked away in a sealed envelope addressed to his attorney, lay a final letter, one that was not to be opened until years after his death. When it was finally read in 2015, its contents stunned historians. "I've outlived the bastard," Scott wrote. "That is some consolation. History will one day uncover what he truly was and what he did to those who stood in his way. I go to my grave with one regret, that I didn't live long enough to see him lose everything as he made me lose what should have been mine. Hollywood made us both cowboys, but only one of us was a snake." Beside the letter was a small leather pouch, inside of which was a yellowed newspaper clipping. John Wayne's photo from the night he won his Oscar for True Grit. Wayne's face had been meticulously cut out. Even after death, Randolph Scott could not bear to look at him. But the real shock came when executors of his will discovered a clause establishing a private foundation, funded quietly through Scott's estate, whose purpose was singular: to support writers and researchers who would re-examine the mythology of John Wayne versus the reality. For decades, that foundation secretly provided grants to scholars and journalists who critically dissected Wayne's life, his politics, and his legacy. Many of the controversial books and documentaries that questioned Wayne's image in the 1990s and 2000s were, in fact, funded by Scott's hidden trust, he reached from beyond the grave, one film historian remarked, to make sure Wayne's legend would never rest easy. Scott's final act was not forgiveness. It was vengeance made eternal. Even in death, he ensured that John Wayne's shadow would never again be unchallenged. But perhaps the greatest irony of all was that their feud, this dark, private hatred, ended up shaping Hollywood itself in ways neither man could have imagined. The rivalry between Randolph Scott and John Wayne wasn't just another Hollywood feud. It became a hidden engine that shaped an entire genre. For over 4 decades, two men who couldn't stand to be in the same room quietly changed the course of the Western film, and in doing so, rewrote cinematic history. Behind the scenes, studios tiptoed around their animosity, treating it like a live grenade. When both names appeared on casting lists, entire production calendars shifted overnight. Invitations were reprinted, security was hired, and contracts included clauses forbidding their simultaneous attendance at film festivals or retrospectives. These men literally couldn't be in the same city without security protocols, a film historian later wrote. Yet to the public, they represented the same ideal, the rugged, moral cowboy. No one ever suspected that behind those wide-brimmed hats was pure venom. Scott's hatred even reached into his will. He included a clause forbidding his movies from ever being screened alongside John Wayne's in the same film series or museum program. That legal restriction still exists today. When the Academy Museum planned a major Western retrospective in 2019, curators were stunned to discover they couldn't show Stagecoach and Ride Lonesome in the same lineup. The two men's hatred had outlived them both. Film historians now see the irony. The very feud that poisoned their personal lives gave birth to artistic evolution. Wayne, desperate to protect his heroic image, leaned deeper into the archetype of the unshakable frontier lawman, the embodiment of American certainty. His films like The Searchers and The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance became myths of moral clarity and courage. Scott, meanwhile, went the opposite way. His later collaborations with directors Bud Boitaker and Sam Peckinpah explored the weary, haunted side of the cowboy, men broken by violence, trapped by their own sense of justice. In trying to outdo each other, they carved two completely different Americas onto the silver screen, one clean and idealized, the other shadowed and human. Their duel defined not only the Western genre, but also the philosophical heart of Hollywood itself, the eternal struggle between myth and truth, legend and man. Director Howard Hawks, who had worked with both, once summed it up perfectly in a private interview. Wayne and Scott lived by the same code their characters preached: loyalty, honor, and revenge. Once crossed, neither man ever forgave. That's why their heroes felt real. They were those men. Even John Ford, the man whose decision to cast Wayne in a Stagecoach had unknowingly started it all, once wrote in a private letter, "I sometimes wonder if I created the bitterest rivalry Hollywood has ever known. By choosing Wayne, I made his career and broke something in the Scott that never healed." And so, in the end, two men, bound by talent, divided by pride, became the twin pillars of the Western myth. Their films, forever separate, defined what it meant to be a man in America, one believing in absolute right, the other wrestling with the cost of it. Their feud was a tragedy, yes, but it was also creation through destruction. A fire that burned them both, yet lit the path for every cowboy story that followed. Like the North and South Poles, one critic said, they defined each other through opposition. Without Wayne, there is no Scott. Without Scott, Wayne's legend means nothing. And perhaps that's the cruelest truth of all, that Hollywood's greatest hate gave birth to its most enduring heroes. The story of Randolph Scott and John Wayne isn't just the tale of two men who hated each other, it's the hidden heartbeat of Hollywood itself. Their rivalry, secret yet all-consuming, shaped not only the Western genre, but also the very way America saw its heroes. Through their decades-long feud, the cowboy myth evolved. Wayne's films came to represent the America people wanted to believe in. Strong, unyielding, righteous. His cowboys were gods of the frontier, men who stood tall and never flinched. His audience saw in him what they wished for themselves, certainty. Scott's cowboys, by contrast, were men scarred by regret. Thoughtful, wounded, more human. They questioned the very ideals that Wayne's characters celebrated. In doing so, they paved the way for the revisionist westerns of the 1960s and 70s, stories like The Wild Bunch and Unforgiven, where heroes bled, doubted, and grew old. The Western didn't split apart by accident, said director Sam Peckinpah, who worked with Scott but never with Wayne. It was divided by two men, one chasing glory, the other haunted by truth. That division between myth and morality reshaped American cinema. Even their supporting casts split into camps. Actors like Lee Van Cleef, James Coburn, and Richard Boone became regulars in Scott's darker, morally ambiguous worlds, while Ward Bond, Harry Carey Jr., and Benny Johnson stood loyal beside Wayne. Hollywood had, quite literally, two warring tribes, Team Scott and Team Wayne. And yet, out of that hostility came brilliance. Their hatred forced them to push harder, perform deeper, and define themselves not by imitation, but by opposition. Each film was a statement, a challenge thrown at the other. In time, historians would come to see this as one of the strangest blessings in cinema history. Their personal animosity drove them to create some of the greatest performances ever captured on film. Their duel, hidden from fans, erased from gossip columns, became the crucible from which the Western was reborn. Even today, more than 4 decades after their deaths, their shadows linger. Whenever a modern filmmaker tells a story of a broken hero or a man haunted by honor, echoes of the Scots' quiet fury and Wayne's unyielding pride can still be felt. To the public, they were cowboys, simple men of courage and conviction. But behind those Stetsons and 6-shooters were two souls locked in a battle that outlasted them both. They defined each other through hate, wrote one critic. Their feud was their art, and their art was their revenge. In the end, perhaps that's what made them legends, because in a town built on illusions, where love fades and fame dies, hatred endured. And from that hatred, Hollywood's greatest stories were born. And so ends one of Hollywood's darkest, most hidden stories. A rivalry so fierce it shaped legions, redefined a genre, and still casts a shadow over the silver screen today. To the world, John Wayne and Randolph Scott were two sides of the same coin, brave, noble cowboys who embodied the strength of the American West. But behind the scenes, their lives told a different story, one of pride, betrayal, vengeance, and wounds that never healed. Their feud began with ambition, burned with envy, and ended in silence, a silence that lasted longer than either man's life. Wayne became the symbol of certainty. Scott became the echo of doubt. Together, they forged the moral compass of the Western, not through friendship, but through hatred. Perhaps that's what makes this story so haunting. Behind every myth lies a truth too raw for Hollywood to tell. And sometimes the greatest legends are born from the deepest grudges. If you found this glimpse into Hollywood's hidden past fascinating, don't forget to give this video a like, subscribe to the channel, and ring that notification bell, because we're just getting started uncovering the secrets behind the golden age of cinema. Tell us in the comments below which forgotten Hollywood feud would you like us to explore next. Until next time, this has been Vanished Legends, where the stars may fade, but their secrets never die.